All right, hey, welcome. We're going to knock out chapter 9 here real quick. Let me get that pulled up for you, and we can begin. And so, chapter 8, we kind of talked about the early American Republic things. The Jackson administration, or the Adams administration, and Thomas Jefferson, and then we're starting to see in chapter 9. Um, Following the War of 1812, we're going to see this period of early industrialization in America. And so, much like the rest of the world during this time frame, everybody's chasing England. England had been at the forefront of industrialization. They had been able to build factories and start to really dominate the world with their manufacturing of textiles, which is just clothing or fabric, right? And so the War of 1812 really shines some light on the fact that the early Americans don't have the ability to produce goods for themselves, and so they were trading with their European allies or European nations, and purchasing things that way. Well, the War of 1812 brings an end to um, trade with England. Obviously, if we're fighting England, it's going to bring it into that. The French Revolution and the war in Europe, that's the Napoleonic Wars that are raging during this time, are going to also further hamper America's ability to trade with Europe. And so America's going to have to find ways to produce goods for themselves. And the North is going to lead this push. The South is sufficient enough by the 1800s, producing cotton and raw materials that they don't really look to industrialize, but the North no, definitely does. The North is going to build all their factories along fast-moving rivers, which are going to turn water wheels. And that's going to be the early power source for industrialization. Eventually, these will be replaced by steam engines, which allow for factories to be built basically anywhere the builder chooses. But at least early on, fast-moving rivers were were the preferred location of factories. The North is going to benefit from the fact that a lot of their rivers are shallow, fast-moving rivers, while the South they have deeper, slower-moving rivers that allows for the movement of large amounts of product, but not necessarily um, the the power of industrial goods. Okay, and so factories are going to replace this thing that we would call the putting out system. And the putting out system is basically just the compartmentalization of the industrial process. So instead of going to a factory and in the factory they produce the thread, and then they weave the thread in the location, and then you cut the thread to make a shirt or whatever, and then you sew it all together. Um, before this, we have something called the putting out system, in which capitalists would basically they would buy, let's say they would buy bales of cotton, and they would take this to somebody that would have a spinning wheel, and they would drop the cotton off with this family, and over the next couple of weeks, that family would work in their downtime to produce thread from that cotton. Then the capitalist would come back. He would pick up the yarn or the thread or whatever and take it to a weaver who would weave that thread into cloth. And then he would go pick that up and the bolts of cloth up, and then he would take it to another family that would cut the cloth into designs or patterns, and then finally he would take it to someplace that would sew those together to make a shirt. And so each step of that process takes time. With the invention of new industrial machines and the use of the water wheel, this whole process gets moved out of individual homes into factories, and that's one way to look at industrialization, right? England had led the world in that. You have guys like Francis Cabot Lowell that go and tour factories in England following the War of 1812, and come back to the United States and start to build factories based on what they saw. Really, during this time frame, you're seeing a lot of oh, I guess it would be like industrial spying, where you try to infiltrate other people's factories and try to learn trade secrets and then bring them back to produce goods of your own, right? By 1850, I know this is kind of jumping from early 1820s, but like within that 50 years, factories are going to be all over the East Coast. Like industrialization is going to happen very, very quickly. And so from 1810 to 1850, really 1860, the North is going to see this big boom in industrialization, right? And things that at one point have been made in small homes or in cottages are now going to be um, economically feasible to purchase because they're made at on factories and they're made much cheaper. So shoemaking and leather tanning and paper making, hat making, all these things. Gun making is going to be a huge one. Gunsmithing is going to all be industrialized, and so it removes the craftsmanship and the small artisans from the goods making process, right? In order to get these jobs, you start to see the early stages of urbanization, in which people begin to move off of farms or off of locations into the city. In the Northeast, by this point, we're about 200 years into settlement in the Northeast, and those family farms that had started off with, maybe 200 acres, which is a pretty sizable farm in the Northeast. Over the years, those have been cut down because you've given to each son his inheritance equally, and so now all of a sudden, you might have a family that's living on 3 or 4 acres, or maybe even less, and they're just not able to make it as farmers. And so this idea of factory work for some becomes very appealing, right? During this time frame, you're going to start to see the early stages of labor organizations, and that will come about really in the late 1800s, where they're going to start to develop power. But for our story right now, it doesn't really necessarily matter. While all that's going on in the East, you're starting to see westward expansion during this time frame as well. The government is starting to sell off large quantities of land in the American West, and so like places like Michigan, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana go up for sale, and you can buy 640 acres at $200 an acre. That's $1,280, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but that's a pretty sizable amount of money in the early 1800s. And so you have you start to see people going into debt to achieve the American dream of land ownership. And so ultimately the goal is just to fill up the West with people and ordinary farmers living on farms and creating this Jeffersonian idea of a democracy in which small farmers live on their own land and produce all the goods they need to survive. Okay, so during the War of 1812, America's under invasion by the British. The Bank of America, which was the nation's bank at that point, it's not a Bank of America like today. It's a privately it's the bank of the government. They stopped issuing hard specie, which is they stop issuing hard money. So they stop issuing gold, they stop issuing silver, and they start to pay debts, and they start to pay they start to circulate more and more paper money. And so when they do that, state banks also begin to do that. And so there's no like today we have the Federal Reserve that regulates how much money is actually in circulation. There's none of that in this time frame. So following the War of 1812, we have this period in which there's too much money in society, and it causes huge amounts of inflation. And so prices soar, and the buying power of money is diminished. And so we have this going on at the same time that people had been moving out to the West, and they start to realize, or they start to discover that farming is very difficult. And so you have a number of people in the West that are trying to either make a farm financially stable, or that they are going through economic hardships in which they're going to possibly lose their farm. And so people are starting to buy up land in the West. They're starting to see this as an opportunity to maybe go into debt in order to purchase land and then sell it later at a greater cost or greater profit. So this is going on. The Napoleonic Wars have come to an end, and so Europe has moved away from constant combat, and they're starting to produce their own foods again. And so the American farmers are going to go through this period in which their crop prices are going to drop, while their land values are also going to drop, and they're not going to be able to pay off the money that they need to maintain their farms. And so when this happens, farmers can't pay back the banks can't get money, and so they start to foreclose on farms. When that happens, businesses can't get loans, and they can't continue to function, and so they start to shut down. And so we start to see this panic of 1819, in which there's just not enough money. There's too much money in society, and inflation and over speculation in land in the West causes an economic bubble in which businesses suffer, and they start to shut down, right? So in order to possibly avert this or come up with a solution, the government just cuts the price of land and the amount of land that you have to buy a farmstead. And so what they ultimately do is they allow more people, more people to purchase land. And so you're moving former factory workers possibly into the American West on smaller plots of land, which are more manageable. We also allow certain people in the Northwest territories like Ohio and Indiana and whatever to return land that they had originally purchased to pay off some of their debt, and so that land gets returned and then resold. And so by 1823, there's enough gold and silver now in circulation to stimulate the economy, and things have stabilized. Other changes that are going to happen during this time period of industrialization. In the South, we're going to see a huge shift away from the production of cash crops in the form of tobacco and rice, and the newfound profitability of cotton. In 1790, Eli Whitney invents something called the cotton gin that increases the ability of an operator to separate cotton from cotton seeds. It revolutionizes not only like the growth of cotton, but also the textile industry, because before 1790, the focus of textiles was on wool, and so you would shear sheep and then you would make your wool and weave it into fabric. After 1790, the preferred fabric is going to become cotton. Before the cotton gin, it would take an adult male about a day's worth of labor, about 8 hours worth of labor, to separate 1 pound of cotton from seed. With the cotton gin, you're able to do 500, 600, 700, 800 pounds of cotton an hour. So that's going to increase the profitability of cotton. It's going to change the agricultural focus of the South away from tobacco and rice and onto cotton. Eli Whitney is also going to come up with the idea of interchangeable parts, which is something that makes sense to us today. Instead of building machines from scratch, you build machines from pre-designed pieces and parts. So instead of rebuilding a machine, if it breaks, you just replace individual pieces. So we have that. Here's one of my favorite little jokes of the class. We have 2 Southerners sitting around, and the guy on the left is like, "Cotton gin, that would taste terrible. Eli Whitney, you're an idiot. Ha 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 ha." All right, there we go. So before the cotton gin, cotton had to be separated by hand, right? It's very time consuming. We kind of discussed that there just for a second. And so wool was definitely the preferred fabric of textiles. After the cotton gin, obviously cotton is much more breathable. It doesn't itch like wool, and it's much more desirable. We also talked about interchangeable parts there. Other inventions that are going to change agriculture is Cyrus McCormick um, um, develops the horse-drawn reaper, which is just basically like an early combine. It's a thrasher, more or less, that can cut down large areas of wheat. Before that, people would cut down wheat with a hand sickle, which was like what the Grim Reaper uses to harvest souls. You would use that to harvest wheat or whatever. And so because of this horse-drawn reaper, farmers could increase their harvest, the lands, they could increase the size of the lands that they could harvest. And so it's going to lead to more output, which is ultimately going to drive prices down, but it provides more food. John Deere is going to improve the plow, which is going to open up the ability to undercut a lot of the prairie grasses in places like Kansas today, and allow for farmers to plant there. Samuel Morse is going to invent the telegraph, which is going to allow for communication. It's going to really allow for the railroad to be functional, because without a telegraph, you wouldn't have communication from railroad station to railroad station. You could have trains colliding. And so now we have telegraph companies that go there. We start to build roads like the Cumberland Road that runs through the Cumberland Gap that opens up westward expansion. You have the Erie Canal that's constructed up from the Hudson River, and it runs all the way up to Lake Erie. That gets opened in 1840 and is one of the longest is the longest canal in North America. Eventually, it gets replaced by the railroads. In the 1820s, from the 1820s to the 1860s, railroads become a huge business in North America and in the United States, getting goods from factories and from ports to selling locations. You can see there, and the speed of movement increases from Boston to Providence, Rhode Island. Used to take 4 days in 1786 at the birth of the nation. By 1840, it takes 4 hours. New rich people start to speculate in trains. Jay Gould and Cornelius Vanderbilt start to make huge profits and build empires on those. You start to see a different class of Americans pop up during this time frame, in which the more money you make, the more you're going to socialize with people of a higher class. The book talks a little bit about the development of a middle class, not necessarily the laborers and factories, but like the accountants or the overseers or the factory bosses. And they're going to start to attribute to themselves certain attributes to their society that allow them to flourish. Middle class women are going to start to stay at home, and you're going to start to see the idea of a stay-at-home mom developed during this time frame. And working class women obviously are working in factories during this time frame to feed families. The Industrial Revolution is going to create a new type of worker in America, someone that's going to labor specifically for wages, which is going to be interesting because we talked about that panic of 1819, and we'll see multiple panics in the 1800s. But if you're poor on a farm and there's there's an economic downturn, well, you still have your food that you're producing, and you're not going to starve to death. This period of industrialization is going to lead to a situation where workers are dependent upon a wage or a job, and so things are going to change in that way. Okay, and wage workers are factory workers in the North, typically against this idea of abolition of slavery, fearing that if you free slaves, it's going to create more competition for factory jobs. And so we'll start to see the shift of some people in the North away from this idea of slavery, and we're going to see the birth of the abolition movement. But typically, the working class people in early industrialization would not have been abolitionists, and so we have that idea. Okay, so that gets us through chapter 9. I'm sorry it took me a little bit of time. There's some confusion on if this was done or not, and so it's up now, and we will get that posted for you here shortly. So we'll come back and see you in chapter 10. Bye.